We don't have a responsibility to turn on have the Dreamers start a reign of terror in our country by their going after their families and other people.
Joining us now for reaction, Dr. Gina Loudon, a TV and radio host, and Capri Cafaro, who is executive in residence at American University School of Public Affairs. Good to see you both.
Absolutely. Good evening.
Good to be with you.
All right, coming to us from Florida down there. I'm a little jealous, but it is a nice night here in D.C. too. All right, Capri, let's start with this. Okay, so the House Minority Leader said that it's basically going to be unleashing a reign of terror if the president does not step in on this. You know, they had this little dinner. She and Senate Minority Leader, like, you know, Chuck Schumer was over there. And when he came out and they came out and said basically there was a deal, the right freaked out. Right. So the president has now said, like, okay, we'll do a deal on Dreamers, but here are the 70 things I'm going to need from you, including the border wall. So where do we go from here?
Well, you know, I think that there's a number of provisions, in my understanding, that we actually, Democrats and Republicans, can come together. For example, E-Verify. And actually, the issue of the wall apparently was something that Democrats were actually talking about back in 2013. So, you know, if you're focusing on some of those things as opposed to, you know, ripping families apart, I think there's concern about, for example, what may happen as far as cracking down on unaccompanied minors, for example. I think that is where Nancy Pelosi is using quite inflammatory language, mind you, but I think that's where the reign of terror is coming in. We need to take that rhetoric aside and actually focus on the areas that we can agree on, because if we really do care, you know, there are deadlines in place. We need to work together to figure out the places where we can come together and then build upon that for comprehensive immigration reform.
And so people understand, when you talk about E-Verify, this is essentially in a system that would require employers who employ people to make sure that they're legit, they have Social Security numbers that check out, and those kinds of things.
Everybody can agree on that. I mean, at the end of the day, employers, if they are the ones that are creating the demand for undocumented individuals, because if they're not going to employ these folks, and maybe they're employing them because they don't want to pay withholding taxes, I say one of the great ways, if we want to raise money, let's actually, you know, find these folks the withholding for Medicare, for Social Security, you know, for workers' comp. What a great way, you know, to crack down on the demand for undocumented and actually put some money back into the coffers for things like Social Security.
All right, so Dr. Gina, when we talk about the fact that there could be some middle ground on some of these issues, we know there are many issues in which there is no agreement, because when the president just a couple of weeks ago came out with his list, like, yes, we give you the so-called Dreamers, we protect them, but here are all the other things that we want. Chuck and Nancy, as you know, they're affectionately called, essentially said this is a complete non-starter. There is no way. So now we have her on ABC Today talking about, quote, reign of terror. How do the sides get together here in Washington to get anything done that's just not more inflammatory, just like we talked about in our last block of the show?
I'm so glad that both of you have framed this up the way you have, and that Chuck and Nancy thing always reminds me of, I don't know, a childhood cartoon I watched or something. But I think Capri's words are a breath of fresh air. I love when I hear Democrats talking about just really logical negotiations that can take place the way that politics is supposed to function. Unfortunately, I don't hear that a lot out of other Democrats, such as Nancy Pelosi, using inflammatory language. You know, I feel like their playbook is first call them racist, like you talked about in your first segment tonight, Shannon. But then if that doesn't work, just go ahead and use some sort of scare tactic like reign of terror. We're not talking about a reign of terror. As Capri pointed to, and you did as well, there's a lot to agree upon here. There's a lot of good that can be done for America. And you know what? After Vegas and everything we've been through recently, Shannon, I think that Americans deserve to put aside the rhetoric and talk about what we can do that's productive and constructive for America.
Okay, so with that in mind, Capri, this is also interesting to me that in this same appearance where the House Minority Leader talked about the reign of terror, she also said these things. She says, I am confidence that President Trump will not walk away from his support for the Dreamers.
Right.
So is it support for the Dreamers, or is it reign of terror for the Dreamers? I'm confused.
You know, you and me both. and I think maybe what this is some rhetoric out of Leader Pelosi. I mean, remember, just a few weeks ago, out in San Francisco, Francisco, in her district, she was actually getting shouted down by folks that, were immigrants, saying, we absolutely, you're not doing enough.
Right.
So I think on one hand, I think maybe she's trying to placate some of the more extreme elements of the base or of this group. And at the same time, I think maybe, sending a signal to the White House to say, we're still willing to play ball. So, a lot of this goes on behind closed doors. I can tell you, I was the minority leader in the Ohio Senate as well for a number of years. And, sometimes what is presented publicly is not necessarily what's happening in negotiations behind closed doors, for better or worse.
Yeah, and Dr. Gina, that's just the way a lot of Washington works, and the way a lot of this gets done is that you have secret back channel things going on. We find out often, I hear around the Hill, that there are bipartisan conversations going on. Weeks ago on things like tax reform and all kinds of other issues, even on immigration, there are groups working together. But publicly, there's this rhetoric that heats up and inflames the most, diverse sides of this conversation. And I don't know that it gets us any closer to a solution when it comes time to vote.
Right, I agree with you. And I don't think, especially the inflammatory language, the use of words like terror, when we have real terrorist threats in this country, President Trump is certainly not a terrorist threat, nor are any of his policies. So I think when we use words like that, when we refer back to the identity politics, these are the things that rip apart the fiber of America. And I believe in the last election, that's what Americans voted against. I believe, yes, they voted for a president who they knew would be willing to lead. And I think from the Republicans' perspective and perhaps for the Trump base, they can know that this president is probably going to negotiate hardcore and come away with something. That's something Republicans haven't been able to look forward to in the last several administrations. It's pretty much been whatever the Democrats demand and the Republicans were just going to kind of fold. I don't think we'll see that under this president's leadership. And I think that we do have a real chance to come to some strongly negotiated good things for this country under this president and with this leadership.
Quickly, do you think we actually get there on some of these things?
I do, and honestly, for the sake of the dreamers, for the sake of their families, and for the sake of America, I certainly hope that that's the case. As we're up against a March deadline, and I think that Americans writ large want to see cooperation. The base and inside the Beltway politics, maybe they don't want to see cooperation. They see it's a dirty word. I can tell you, the lion's share of Americans want to see people come together for real solutions.
They do on any number of topics, and immigration is just one of them. All right, Capri, Gina, thank you very much. Have a great weekend.